Now you've got coming from the west and from the north, headed towards Crimea, when they're able to bring their HIMARS and other rocket launchers forward, and you start hitting Russian bases in Crimea with rockets on a daily basis, then I think Crimea becomes untenable for the Russian Air Force and the logistics and those things. And then I think it's a matter of time.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. These are pivotal weeks in Ukraine, and to some degree in Russia. Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, has carried out this great charade of pretending referendums were fairly held in eastern Ukraine as a pretext for annexation. He is the only leader in history, I think, who annexes land as his army is retreating from it and bombing the very areas he said he was liberating and protecting. Threats continue to be nuclear. If the conflict is about to be frozen by winter, you wouldn't know it because Ukrainian forces are rapidly advancing, retaking areas from a Russian army that is on the run and in reverse. On this backstory, former U.S. Army commander in Europe, Ben Hodges, who predicts soon the Crimea itself will come under attack, and he minimizes the nuclear threat from Putin. And in Russia, journalist and longtime friend Fred Weir, who discusses how is Russia changing now, and Russians themselves, who now openly discuss defeat. All right, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges is the former commander of U.S. Army Europe, and he joins me now from Poland. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Dana, how are you?
Sir, good to talk to you again. Is Russia the first nation in history to announce a series of annexations while its troops are in reverse and retreating?
That's quite a combination. It certainly has got to be humiliating almost, or at least embarrassing for the Kremlin to have this happening and to watch the public commentators try to explain what's going on to the public. But I think that increasingly two very important social things are happening. Number one, nobody in Europe, I mean, not even some of the most hardcore Kremlin verstehers, as Germans call them, sympathizers, are acknowledging that these referenda are legitimate or that the annexations are legal. Nobody. I mean, even the Secretary General of the United Nations, who has not been especially tough, even he came out immediately and said these are absolutely not legal. So that's an important change in the political and social dynamic from the West. And then inside Russia, it seems to me that increasingly the population is they're no longer concealing their unhappiness or disagreement. It's coming out more and more in the open in different ways, and I think this will be an important thing to watch.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And as somebody who watches social media and watches media, mainstream media in Russia, I mean, it is startling, I think, what's been happening in the last week, where you see a lot of these commentators coming on nightly television now and acknowledging problems, acknowledging the fact that they have had to retreat from Lyman, for instance, and the large areas of Kherson, trying to put some positive spin on it, that they're going to, get these 300,000 new draftees in there, and that will somehow change the situation. But there does seem to be genuine panic and alarm that this war is not going the way that they were told originally it would easily go.
Yeah, that's important. The even within that mafia sort of system of government that they have there still has to be some degree of trust. People, have to be able to count, even if they assume that there is a percentage of misinformation or incompetence or whatever. And so the depth of the corruption and the depth of the deception is, I think people are starting to come to grips with that, because then you start worrying about, well, what else is my government covering up? I mean, how unsafe are these nuclear power plants? How unsafe is our water? How unsafe is, whatever. And so I think, I think you and I have talked about this before. we could be looking at the front end of the collapse of the Russian Federation. I'm not advocating for that, but I do advocate that we need to be prepared for it. And a lot can happen over the next several months internally within Russia when you combine the battlefield losses, which seem to really be piling up now, this atrocious and poorly managed mobilization effort, the tens of thousands of military-age males that have departed Russia, and then the impact of sanctions it's having on the domestic side, not just on the defense industry. There's a lot of forces at work here, a lot of centrifugal forces that could not shear off, but could launch some of these ethnic republics.
Do you think that the Russian front line is going through what appears to be almost a complete collapse in areas?
I think we know from history that sometimes when you have a massive penetration, a breakthrough of some sort, psychologically, it can have a devastating effect, especially if you're talking about soldiers that are not disciplined or trained. I mean, well-trained, confident units don't worry too much about when the enemy gets to your rear because you know that somebody else will take care of it and you're going to stay and do your job. When you're not disciplined and you don't have confidence about who's around you or behind you, it can very quickly turn into a panic. And so that's how these collapses can occur. I don't know for sure that that's going to happen, but it has that kind of feeling. And you have to wonder inside the Russian formations, the will to fight, would they rather surrender or would they rather get out of there? And I think we'll probably see a combination of all three of those in the Kharkiv Donetsk Oblast, in Kherson, and then of course, all roads lead to Crimea.
So talk to me about Crimea, because I know you've been quoted by other people as saying that you think the Ukrainians will not only go after Crimea, that a lot of people need to remember that was annexed illegally according to the international community in 2014. Not only will they go after it, but you think they will win, the Ukrainians will win Crimea, the home of Putin's Black Sea Fleet.
Well, the Black Sea Fleet has been underwhelming, certainly below what I had expected before this all started. And, they're hugging the coastline there of Crimea under the protection of Russian air defense because they're so worried about Ukrainian anti-ship missiles. And Ukraine didn't even have a navy, but yet the Black Sea Fleet is not contributing. Their submarines, I have seen reports that their subs relocated from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, the Russian Navy base on the mainland on the other side of Kerch Straits. I do believe that as this counteroffensive continues to make progress, particularly after they finally do eliminate this Kherson pocket, which I think is going to happen probably. It's hard to say. This is a pretty significant force, but they're trapped. So it'll take some time, but eventually when that's gone, now you've got coming from the west and from the north, headed towards Crimea, when they're able to bring their HIMARS and other rocket launchers forward, and you start hitting Russian bases in Crimea with rockets on a daily basis, then I think Crimea becomes untenable for the Russian Air Force and the logistics and those things. And then I think it's a matter of time.
Talk to me about these ATACMS that people speak about. These are essentially launched, as I understand it, from the same platform as the HIMARS, but they are much longer in range. And you believe that the U.S. administration, which up until now has not given them to Ukraine, should just get on with it and give them to the Ukrainian army?
Yeah, ATACMS, great Army acronym. I can't remember what all it stands for, but it's a rocket that has a range of about 300 kilometers. So same launcher, the HIMARS truck, and the configuration now, it has a 6-pack on the back, 6 Gimlers, GMLRS rockets that have the range of out to about, 100, a little over 100 kilometers, around 100 kilometers. ATACMS more than 3 times that range. But there's only one ATACMS rocket that's fired at a time. It's not in a 6-pack. It's a bigger round, obviously. That would be good because its straight line distance from Odessa to Sevastopol is 300 kilometers. So they could already be hitting these critical logistics hubs and air bases in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine if they had ATACMS. Now, of course, the administration is concerned that if the Ukrainians had ATACMS, that they would use them against Russian air bases in Belgorod and, inside Russia proper or inside Belarus. And I can understand their concern because that, they've been concerned all along that something might finally cause Russia to escalate to a nuclear weapon or something like that. I think, frankly, if the Russians are murdering Ukrainian civilians with missiles that are flying out of Russia, then those are legitimate targets. But I think the Ukrainians have said, look, if you give us ATACMS, we won't shoot them into Russia. I mean, that would be an easy thing for the U.S. to control. So I think it's this is one of the very few areas where I disagree with the administration's approach to this war.
You just made me look it up, sir. It's the Army Tactical Missile System.
I'm impressed.
No, I looked it up. I didn't know. I couldn't remember what the acronym is for either. When you talk about the nuclear threat from Russia, you and I have spoken about this before, and there's been an evolution here since February, where originally NATO countries don't really want to speak about it too much because they don't want to give it too much credence. But increasingly, with the rhetoric that's coming out of Russia, these nuclear threats are being taken more seriously, and the possibility of a tactical weapon being used somewhere by Russia, whether it be on the battlefield or whether it be a demonstration detonation in the Black Sea or elsewhere, is being more and more likely. Now, the administration, forgive me for the long question, but the administration says that they have warned Russia, most recently, even in the last week or so, do not detonate a tactical nuclear missile. But they continue to use the language that they would respond with an overwhelming conventional attack. Do you think, and people will look back on this, do you think that the Biden administration is being tough enough in their language with Russia, properly warning them of consequences if they deploy a tactical nuclear missile somewhere?
So, first of all, I think the administration has been very clear. President Biden said it on TV. Jack McFarland has said it. And I would expect that there have been multiple communications, parallel, behind the scenes, different interlocutors to various people in the Kremlin. There's no mistake that they know that the United States has said, do not use a nuclear weapon of any type. If you do, the response will be devastating. It will change the face of the war for Russia, which is what President Biden said. So,
as somebody as a military insider, as somebody who has been in planning, both in America and then in NATO and Europe, what do you think they mean by devastating?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. The key is, do the Russians believe it that we would actually do it? There's no doubt they've been told. There's no doubt that they've been told. And I would also bet that the Chinese have communicated to them and say, this is a terrible, I do not even think about doing that. So I imagine that the Kremlin's getting all kinds of pressure on this. The key is, do they really believe that we would do something that would be so devastating? Now, what does devastating mean? I would expect that the Pentagon and the National Security Staff have drawn up a list of options for the president. A full range of everything from an angry email to total destruction and everything in between. And there could be a combination of economic factors, kinetic, non-kinetic, nuclear, non-nuclear, any sort of a combination that would be based on probably what did the Russians do? So proportional. Because this would also, I feel confident, would be done in consultation with our allies, because our allies would have to deal with the consequences as well. Now, the U.S. won't ask permission to do it, but I think this administration has done a good job of consulting with allies. So that's one thing. Proportional. Also, do it in a way that does not automatically lead to escalation. So, in other words, unlikely that a response would involve a strike inside the motherland, Russia, unless the nuclear weapon the Russians used came from there. So, looking for ways to contain it, but being damaging enough that it was clear that there's a lot more where this came from. Do not do that again. I think, if I was to bet, I would think a non-nuclear response would be more likely than a nuclear response. And there's so many things that could be done, whether it was to Black Sea Fleet or ground forces, stuff inside Ukraine or in the Black Sea.
Your old boss, General Petraeus, was interviewed. Your old boss, when you were in the 101st Airborne, I mean, was interviewed, and he talked about just some of the things you mentioned. And they would destroy Russian troops in Ukraine. They would destroy the Black Sea Fleet. It was interesting to when the discussion turned to, is this an Article 5 situation? Now, obviously, it's not an Article 5 situation because Ukraine is not in NATO. But if there are radioactive clouds blowing over Europe, is that an Article 5 situation?
So keep in mind, and I know you know this, but maybe not all your viewers do, there's nothing automatic about Article 5. It's not a laser beam like you walk through it and the door opens up. It's not that kind. There's no triggering of Article 5. It is, at the end of the day, a political decision where typically a nation would go to the North Atlantic Council and say, this has happened. We believe that this is an armed attack on us, and therefore, under the Washington Treaty, this should be considered an armed attack on all. So, the alliance has, for example, has evolved to the point where certain types of cyber attacks could be considered an armed attack. And certainly, I would expect if there was a nuclear strike that led to nuclear fallout on a NATO country, I mean, it could be that a nation, whether it was Poland or Lithuania or Romania, whoever it was that was affected by it, could go to the North Atlantic Council and say, this is clearly an armed attack on us, because the Russians would have known exactly what the downwind prediction would be for this type of weapon, air bursts, ground bursts, prevailing winds. They would know that. I mean, we practiced that when I was a lieutenant. You knew how to do a downwind prediction. And then do the nations agree that, and let's say, even if all 30 nations agree that, yes, that was an armed attack, and therefore we consider armed attack on us, they are still not compelled to have to do something about it. So I don't know if there's value in that, but the ambiguity is important. The Russians should be thinking, if we do something that produces a fallout downwind that affects a NATO country, they should be very worried that now they've got 30 nations are going to get involved.
And as you mentioned before, it's circumstance-based. It really depends what, where, and who's affected.
But there is no doubt in my mind that the U.S. will have to respond because China, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, other countries that have nuclear weapons will be watching how we respond. Do we respond? So this is about more than just a nuclear weapon that might possibly be utilized inside Ukraine.
General Hodges, you're always generous with your time, so I'll make this the last question, and I appreciate it very much. The speech that President Putin made on Friday when he announced the annexation of these 4 regions in Ukraine, I mean, I was struck by suddenly this guy who was railed on about denazifying Ukraine, didn't even mention Nazis, really. He's railed on about the NATO threat. We didn't really go on about NATO very much at all. Suddenly now he's just talked about the moral vacuum of liberal democracies. He's called us all, satanic, Western, democratic, liberal leading countries. there seems to be, I mean, a declaration on the West, and it's hard to put your finger on exactly what is driving Putin and this war anymore.
Well, it certainly is not a legitimate concern about a threat to Russia's territorial integrity. I mean, the safest part of Russia has always been the part that touched NATO, and now that part is going to grow because he's driven Finland and Sweden into, particularly Finland, which touches Russia, into joining the alliance. So I can't fully articulate what it is that motivates him, other than this illusion of trying to bring back what Peter the Great had, and this empire, this very nationalistic sense of entitlement almost. I think that he does seem very disconnected from reality, and I don't know if that's just because he's disconnected. People below him are scared to tell him the truth, or he refuses to believe what we all see. For me, the key is the people around him. He cannot launch a nuclear weapon by himself, and while I think he is evil, I don't think he's crazy. I don't think he's suicidal, and I don't think the people around him are suicidal. And so the object of our information efforts should be those people around him saying, look, if you have any shred of hope that you think you might be able to get back to some sort of normalcy after all this is over in the post-Putin era, then you will make sure he does not attempt to use a nuclear weapon. Because if he does, then all of you will be held accountable as well. And your families will never have a chance to get back in your apartment in Belgravia, or send your kid to school somewhere, and all your yachts, all that stuff. You'll have zero future. There are zero positive upsides for Russia to use a nuclear weapon. And so I think, and I suspect that those kinds of communications are going on now.
Ben Hodges, great to talk to you, sir.
Thank you for the privilege, Dana.
All right, Fred Weir joins us from very close to Moscow. I assume you're just outside of Moscow, Fred.
Yep. Yeah. 6 kilometers.
So are you an undesirable? I mean, they have classified a lot of foreign journalists in that category, whatever that means.
So far, it's just state journalists who are getting either kicked out or branded as foreign agents, like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was kicked out of here. And it's purportedly in retaliation for the treatment of Russia Today and Sputnik and so on in our countries, which is true enough. I can't support the way we've cracked down on Russian media. I don't think that's within the range of our principles or wise, but we have, and given them the pretext to do it to us.
All right. Well, that's a big debate, because Russia Today was certainly a platform for pure propaganda from the Kremlin. But then again, I guess you could argue that Fox News is from the Republican Party. So there's lots of parallels.
Yeah, and I think our basic ethic in our societies where we grew up is that we let people read or hear everything and decide for themselves. When the state starts telling you what you can hear and what you can't, we're into a completely different territory.
I want to talk to you about Russian media, because I have never seen the changes that I've seen probably in the last couple of weeks. And I don't know if you will agree with me, but suddenly, people lamenting the losses to the Russian army in Ukraine, the setbacks, very critical on television of Russian army commanders. I mean, to the point that one host said, why, at least in World War II or in the Soviet times, they would shoot themselves rather than retreat. Why don't these guys stop? Why don't they shoot themselves? Why don't they stop lying? some pretty amazing open discussion about how the Russian army, to put it politely, is on a back foot, but they're in retreat and they're losing territory, and that's now being admitted on Russian television.
Yeah, actually, I've written about this quite a bit. There are Russian war correspondents embedded with Russian forces in every front. Some of them are really good. I've done interviews with a couple of them. Smart, capable guys of military background. One of whom I know personally, and I follow his Telegram channel. He was embedded with U.S. infantry in Afghanistan and Iraq. He learned a lot of his trade doing that. They carry the Russian narrative. They're pro-Russia, obviously, and they take as the guys around them, the troops they're embedded with, as their primary sources, obviously. But they are the ones delivering a lot of that criticism you're talking about. They've seen the screw-ups there, especially on the Kharkov front. They've seen commanders not living up to expectations. They've done a lot of really what you'd call good reporting. I mean, within the limits of embedded correspondence, they're doing just as well as American embedded correspondents do in their wars.
Right, but they weren't doing this at the beginning, and even if there were problems, they were not talking about them openly. Why suddenly are they able to speak about it? And by the way, part of that narrative is building this idea that they're fighting NATO, that they're not fighting Ukraine, that they're fighting NATO, and you hear that nightly on Russian television. But why suddenly is the Kremlin allowing them and allowing some of their big hosts in the evening news to really be self-critical, and why the Russian army is being pushed back?
Okay, two things. First of all, I would say, since I follow these guys on their Telegram channels all along, they have reported pretty accurately in real time the to's and fro's of this war from the very start. But the big TV shows, the flagship, nightly news programs and so on, the criticism has broken through to them, I think, because those voices who from the very beginning, and if you followed them on their Telegram channels, you would know, were saying that Russia is not fighting the war in the right way. They were fighting with a small force, relatively small force, 200,000 men, mostly volunteers, contract soldiers, and the separatist militias. In fact, a lot of the fighting has been done by militias of Donetsk and Lugansk, not by the regular Russian army. And the hawkish voices, the nationalists, have been saying from the very beginning, we need to take this seriously. None of this special military operation crap. We need to go in there, bomb infrastructure, like the bridges over the Dnieper, the electrical stations, the dams. It's what the Americans would do, they said, and we're not doing that. Sladkov, this war correspondent I was talking about, has been saying that from the very start, that we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back.
But why? You made the point, so let me just point that the war correspondents have been fairly honest on the ground, if that's true. But why have nightly news hosts suddenly switched the narrative and are admitting that things are not going the way they should?
Because things started going radically bad. I think that the defeat in Kharkov region, this ceding of really huge territory, the setbacks in Kherson, these major setbacks focused minds in Moscow, finally got through, I guess, to Putin. It seems to be Putin who decides all these things. And therefore, these people suddenly look like the men of the hour who were right all along, and they're getting their voices on nightly TV now. And Putin indeed has at least partly conceded to them. I mean, the mobilization underway, it was not what Putin wanted. He wanted a war that would not be fought by conscripted men, so that it wouldn't affect the population. So, it's like American wars, now fought by professional armies. And so the average person doesn't feel directly connected to it the way they did during Vietnam, when their sons and husbands and brothers were getting drafted and sent over there. It's a completely different social mood when that happens. And that's happening now. But that's
right. And there is some political risk in that, correct? Because suddenly people from Moscow, from St. Petersburg, start losing loved ones in this war, and they really start questioning what the hell are they there for?
Well, yeah, exactly. It puts a completely different complexion on it. That's why I guess Putin resisted doing it until these recent setbacks. But of course, it's those guys, those nationalists, the hawks, if you want to call them that, who were arguing for it all along, who now are given a much more prominent place in the Russian media.
Did you also sense, Fred, some change in Putin's narrative when you listen to that long speech that he did on annexation from the Kremlin, and then some of his cheerleading on Red Square afterwards? What happened to denazification? Suddenly, it became this hate fest on Western liberal democracies. This new thing about Satanism. I mean, there was kind of a right-hand turn there. Would you, if maybe you wouldn't agree on the 90 degrees, but let's see where you line up on it.
Okay, sure. He certainly, it's always been there, the idea that the West is degenerate. It tracks with right-wing, populism in the West. And it's why there does seem to be some rapport between a lot of, say, American right-wingers who you wouldn't have thought would be Putin fanboys, but he's a white Christian, traditionalist, social conservative, and so he plays to that, and to some extent he's talking to mainstream Russia. This is a very conservative society, but I do see the point of how we're fighting the United West. That point resonates in Russia, and the West, frankly, does, certainly the United States does feed that perception by giving all this money, all these arms, and bragging about how they're giving intelligence to kill Russian generals and sink Russian ships. I mean, that does play right into the Putin narrative that we're fighting against NATO, not just Ukraine. But this idea that Russia is different, Russia is standing up for traditional values is an old theme, but he is resorting much more explicitly to it. And he did, I thought, to the point of being ridiculous in that speech, like bashing trans rights and things like, what the heck is that?
Well, that plays into this right-wing conservative narrative.
Sure, it plays to those guys.
Some sympathy even on right-wing cable in America.
Well, sure, but it doesn't. I don't think most.
I'm not justifying it.
No, of course, and it does, but and he obviously thinks that way, but it's not. These are not issues in Russia. I mean, we don't have gender-affirming care for young kids in Russia. It's not an issue here, and the average person doesn't know what the heck it is. So I don't know who he was talking to when he went off on those tangents.
I don't know who he was talking to either, but do you think that this plays to Putin's state of mind in any way? And would you comment on what you think his state of mind is right now?
I think he's first of all, I don't think he's crazy, and I don't think he's isolated. I think he's being told what's going on. Like, he just has to switch on his TV and watch the nightly news to know what's going on. So it's not that he's in some bubble where he's living in an alternate universe. But he is doubling down on the themes that brought Russia to this point of conflict with Ukraine in the West. He definitely is.
Prigozhin, a longtime associate of Putin's, he was called Putin's chef. He's run this Wagner group, which is arms for hire, go get it done outside of the regular army channels in Africa, in Syria, on the ground in Ukraine. Suddenly, police detain an employee of Prigozhin's media group, and they put out video of him being tackled by police and being arrested. There's also talk that the Wagner group gunned down a lieutenant colonel in the Russian army in a deadly episode of friendly fire that the Kremlin supposedly has been trying to sweep under the rug. Does this show a crack in Putin's inner circle, or is that carrying it too far?
I don't think so. I think that the Wagner group is a loose cannon. It's
literally.
Well, it's mainly Russian veterans who get paid a lot of money, and they are doing a lot of the hard fighting down there. It's around Bakhmut, where they're advancing. It's one of the few places where the Russians are advancing right now. It's the Wagnerites who are doing it, and he gets a lot of credit. He's come out of the shadows. He's one of those who has come out of the shadows and been.
Originally, he denied he was even part of it.
Even part of it. Now the Wagnerites are getting a lot of credit, but they're loose cannons. It's the same thing like Blackwater. Those private mercenary outfits that
guns for hire.
Yeah, and they tend to be not in the chain of command, and often don't get the memo about how you're supposed to behave. So I would expect that, but I wouldn't expect it to be like a really serious problem.
Just a couple of quick questions. What would you say about how mobilization has gone and the astounding number of people that are crossing the borders into Kazakhstan, into Georgia, through Finland, someone over Mongolia? The numbers are all over the place. But these are recorded numbers by border guards, and some of them are quite credible. Between 700,000 and 1 million Russians have fled in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, I doubt that it's that high, but it's a lot. It's like hundreds of thousands of people, mainly military-age men, who are evading the draft. I know, as in you are a Canadian, more or less of my generation. My family used to take in draft dodgers in the 60s. We had thousands and thousands, about 100,000 Americans came to Canada, and it was really good for Canada. So I had these guys in my house, in my home. I grew up listening to them. They're really nice guys, and I'm sure these Russian guys are too. They're the best, and it's too bad. But to push back against that image, it's true. It's all true. But the evening television shows are full of pictures of recruitment centers which are full of people showing up for duty and getting inducted, getting on buses, getting their kit, getting on buses, going to the training and deployment centers. The Minister of Defense said the other day that 200,000 have been inducted so far, and I'm sure that's true.
Do you think that that's a serious mobilization, that these guys hold any hope of doing what a fairly professional army has so far failed to do in Ukraine? Do you think that this mobilization is going to make any kind of difference at all, aside from the sheer numbers of it?
Sure. You think that about Ukraine, don't you? They've done the same thing. They've carried out mass mobilization, scraping people out of cafeterias and off the street and putting them into uniform, and we think.
But with uniforms, with guns, with bulletproof vests, with some training. Whereas a lot of people think the Russians are just being it's cannon fodder.
No, they're not. There are 25 million men in Russia with past military experience of military age. Let's get serious here. The mathematics are such. And the 200,000 guys are mostly people who had basic training and military training before, or they have some special skills that have application, maybe not on the front line, maybe in the rear, in electronics or engineering or something. But I'm pretty sure the Russians will they will double their forces by January, and they will be just as good as the regular army. And anybody who thinks so, it's wishful. There's a lot of wishful thinking in the way people analyze these things. You just want it to be so, and you should. The mechanism I try to use is, if you say this about the Russians, they're suffering these casualties, they have these logistics problems, they're exhausted, they're running out of manpower. Apply the same yardstick to the Ukrainians and see how that works, because they're also taking horrific casualties. They're maxing out on mobilization. They got NATO behind them. They got an endless arms pipeline, but Russian industry is working at full steam. And they've now got full wartime priority. They'll put out the tanks. They'll put out the bulletproof vests. It's the mathematics are such. I worry about the politics of it. I mean, I think if Russia is going to break down, it won't be on that field. It will be in the Kremlin, in the political will to do this thing, which I think it was a reckless thing from the start. It went all kinds of bad for Russia, and this is where the weak point is.
Whether the Kremlin has the staying power, whether there'll be cracks in the elite and the decision makers. The toll is high economically as well. But just to go back to what you said, because it's really important. Sitting in the West, we are often inundated with a lot of positive reports from the battlefield that the Ukrainians are going forward, the Russians are retreating, that the battle has turned, and it is unsustainable for Russia. And you don't seem to, you think that that's a bit naive, that in fact, if Putin wants to stick with this, and I have no doubt, watching him in Chechnya and other conflicts, that he will not easily turn back from this war in Ukraine. So you feel it's naive to think that this is ending anytime soon, and that the Russian army still doesn't have a fight to give?
I think it's premature. But I'll say this, if the Russians are going to collapse, if their front lines are going to collapse, and they're going to panic and run away, it will happen in the next couple of weeks. These Ukrainian offensives were huge, but they were probably all Ukraine's got right now anyway to throw, and they're doing pretty well. But the news reports right now are that the Russians are stabilizing the lines in Kherson and there in Luhansk. I don't know, but if it's going to happen before the mud season sets in, it will happen by the end of October. If not, then you're looking at a new war in January when the ground freezes, the forests are defoliated by winter, Russian aviation is up, and the Russian reinforcements are on the front, and then that's a different war for sure.
Fred Weir, always good to talk to you. It really is a different perspective sometimes from what we get elsewhere, and great to talk to you. Take care, my friend. Always a pleasure. Thanks. Stay out of trouble.
I'll try.
And that's our backstory for this week. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to my newsletter, danalewis.substack.com. I am Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.